October 14th, 1943, 4:47 in the morning, 16 kilometers southwest of Melitopol, Ukrainian SSR. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Vasilievich Orlov stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching 300 men form into ragged lines across a frost-covered field. The smell of cheap Makorka tobacco mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies and fierce sweat. Behind him, NKVD blocking detachment troops checked their PPSH-41 submachine guns, ensuring full magazines. Ahead, across 800 meters of winter wheat stubble, German positions bristled with MG-42 machine guns and carefully laid S-mine fields. Orlov held a roster listing the crimes of the men before him: cowardice under fire, unauthorized retreat, anti-Soviet agitation, theft of military property, sleeping on guard duty. Some had done nothing more than survive encirclement, when their units were destroyed. It didn't matter. They were shtrafnye now, penal soldiers, human minesweepers. In his pocket, Orlov carried written orders signed by Colonel General Fyodor Tobukin himself. Penal Battalion 227 will advance across suspected mine zones at 05:20 hours. Infantry assault will follow once paths are cleared. Refusal to advance will be met with immediate execution. Redemption through blood. Orlov had commanded this battalion for 6 weeks. He had written 73 letters to mothers, wives, and fathers. He would write many more today. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. German S-mines, nicknamed bouncing Betties by the Americans, were buried at intervals of roughly 4 meters. When triggered by a 3-kilogram pressure, they launched 1 meter into the air before detonating, sending 360 steel balls in all directions at chest height. A man caught in the blast radius rarely survived. The field before them likely contained between 200 and 400 mines. By dawn, perhaps 100 of his men would be dead or dying. The rest would have cleared pathways for the regular infantry waiting in reserve trenches 300 meters behind. This was Soviet military doctrine in the desperate autumn of 1943. Spend the guilty to save the innocent. Sacrifice the condemned to preserve the loyal. Clear obstacles with bodies instead of engineers. If you're watching this story, hit that subscribe button now. What happened next reveals one of World War II's darkest truths, a story the Soviet Union suppressed for 60 years. The Red Army's penal battalion system emerged from catastrophic losses and Stalin's paranoid fury during the summer of 1942. In July alone, the Wehrmacht had destroyed or captured over 1 million Soviet soldiers during Operation Blue, the German drive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Entire armies evaporated in encirclements that the German staff had perfected since 1941. Soviet troops, inadequately trained and poorly led after Stalin's purges had gutted the officer corps, often broke under German assault. Units retreated without orders. Soldiers abandoned positions. Some surrendered. Others simply melted away into the vast Russian landscape, hoping to survive until the front moved past them. Stalin's response was Order Number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, titled "Not One Step Back." The order's language was brutal and explicit. Panic mongers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot. Commanders who permit unauthorized withdrawal will be removed and sent to trial by military tribunal. Each army will form 3 to 5 well-armed blocking detachments of up to 200 men, positioned behind unreliable divisions. Their assignment: shoot anyone retreating without orders. But execution wasn't the only punishment. Order 227 also created shtrafnye battalony, penal battalions for officers and technical personnel, and shtrafnye roti, penal companies for enlisted men. These units would be composed of soldiers guilty of cowardice, desertion, unauthorized retreat, or crimes against military discipline. They would be given the most dangerous assignments, the missions regular troops couldn't or wouldn't accomplish. They would redeem themselves through blood, or they would die trying. The term used officially was expendable krov'yu, redemption through blood. Survive 3 months of combat assignments, or be wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization, and a shtrafnyk's record would be cleared. He could return to regular units with his rank restored and his honor, theoretically redeemed. The reality was that few survived long enough to see redemption. By October 1943, the Red Army operated approximately 170 penal battalions in over 400 penal companies. Each battalion contained between 500 and 800 men, commanded by regular Army officers with clean records, usually men like Orlov, who had displeased superiors but weren't guilty enough for their own penal service. The battalions were supported by NKVD blocking detachments, typically 30 to 50 men armed with machine guns, positioned behind the shtrafnye during attacks. Their orders were explicit: shoot anyone who retreated, hesitated, or attempted desertion. The penal soldiers themselves were equipped with minimal gear. One rifle for every 2 to 3 men was standard, sometimes one for every 5. Those without weapons carried shovels, axes, or simply their bare hands. Ammunition was rationed, often just 30 rounds per rifle. The logic was simple and monstrous. Penal soldiers were meant to absorb enemy fire, locate defensive positions, and trigger mines. Once the enemy revealed his positions and the paths were cleared, regular infantry would exploit the gaps the shtrafnye had opened with their bodies. Pyotr Orlov had been a promising major in the 203rd Rifle Division until August 1943, when his regiment failed to take a German strongpoint at Izayum. The divisional commander needed a scapegoat. Orlov, who had argued against the frontal assault on tactical grounds, was reduced to senior lieutenant and assigned to command Penal Battalion 227. He was given a choice: lead the shtrafnye for 6 months and earn back his rank, or face court-martial for defeatist attitudes. He chose the Penal Battalion. Now, 6 weeks later, he understood that his assignment was itself a form of execution, just slower than a firing squad. He had arrived at the battalion with 320 men. After operations at Mariupol, Taganrog, and Osipenko, only 97 of those original shtrafnye remained alive. Replacements arrived daily. Men pulled from punishment cells, soldiers who had retreated from untenable positions, junior officers who had questioned orders, even a few former NKVD troops who had themselves committed infractions. The battalion's current strength was 294. By tomorrow, it would need replacements again. Among the men forming up in the darkness was Private Dmitry Antonovich Sokolov, 32 years old, formerly a schoolteacher from Tula. His crime: falling asleep on sentry duty after 48 hours without rest. His punishment: 6 months in a penal company, later merged into Orlov's battalion. This was Sokolov's 7th mission as a shtrafnik. He had survived minefields twice, a frontal assault on German trenches at Melitopol, and a suicidal reconnaissance in force that had cost 60 men to confirm German positions. He had been wounded once, shrapnel in his left shoulder, but it wasn't serious enough for redemption. The battalion medic had stitched him up and sent him back to the line within 3 days. Sokolov had learned the mathematics of survival. Stay in the middle of the formation during advances. Never at the front where mines claimed the first casualties. Never at the rear where the NKVD machine guns watch for cowards. Watch the ground for disturbed earth, wire, or freshly turned soil. Move when explosions forced everyone forward. Stop when the group stopped. Think of nothing beyond the next 10 meters. Emotion was a luxury that killed you. Beside Sokolov stood Junior Sergeant Grigory Mikhailovich Petrov, a former tanker whose T-34 had been knocked out during the Battle of Kursk. Petrov had escaped the burning tank, his face permanently scarred by fire. But he had retreated with his crew instead of staying to fight as infantry, and the commissar attached to his tank brigade had written him up for abandoning combat without authorization. His sentence: redemption through service in a penal battalion. Petrov was one of the few shtrafnye who had a rifle, a battered Mosin Nagant 9130 with a loose stock and a barrel worn smooth from overuse. He had 30 rounds in his pouches, more than most. He had earned the weapon by being one of the few in his group to actually close with German positions during the last attack. The commissar had noted his aggressive spirit and granted him the rifle as a reward. Now Petrov checked the bolt action for the 100th time, making sure it cycled smoothly. A jammed rifle in the assault meant death. He didn't care about redemption anymore. He just wanted to survive another day. At 4:52 in the morning, Lieutenant Orlov walked along the formation, his boots crunching through frost. The temperature was just below freezing, cold enough that the men's breath formed clouds in the darkness. He could see their faces in the faint light of approaching dawn. Hollow-eyed, exhausted, resigned. Some trembled from cold or fear, or both. A few prayed silently, lips moving without sound. Others stared at nothing, already dead inside. Orlov stopped in front of a young man who couldn't have been more than 18. A private named Alexei, whose crime was stealing bread from an officer's ration. "What's your name, soldier?" Orlov asked quietly. "Private Alexei Ivanovich Karpov, comrade senior lieutenant." The boy's voice shook. "First mission?" "Yes, comrade senior lieutenant." "Stay behind the man in front of you. Step exactly where he steps. If he triggers a mine, move around the crater and keep going. Don't stop. Don't look back. The Germans will open fire once the first mines detonate. Get across the field as fast as you can. Understand?" "Yes, comrade senior lieutenant." The boy was going to die. Orlov knew it. First-timers always died. They froze when the first mine went off, or they panicked and ran in the wrong direction, or they simply couldn't process the horror fast enough to adapt. But Orlov couldn't tell him that, so he patted the boy's shoulder and moved on. Behind the Penal Battalion, Captain Nikolai Vasilyevich Zhukov commanded the NKVD blocking detachment, 40 men armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns and 3 Maxim M1910 heavy machine guns mounted on wheeled carriages. Zhukov was 28, a party member since 1938, a veteran of the NKVD border troops who had been transferred to blocking detachments in 1942. He had shot 11 men in the past 6 months, all shtrafnye who had attempted to retreat during attacks. He felt nothing about it. His orders were clear: maintain discipline, prevent unauthorized withdrawal, ensure the penal soldiers fulfilled their function. If they advanced, they might die from German fire or mines. If they retreated, they would certainly die from his machine guns. The equation was designed to produce only one rational behavior: forward movement. Zhukov checked his watch. 4:56. 4 minutes. He lit a cigarette and watched the penal battalion's ragged line. Some of the shtrafnye were crying. Others laughed with the manic edge of men who had given up. A few urinated where they stood, too frightened or too practical to care about dignity. Behind Zhukov's blocking detachment, regular infantry from the 51st Army waited in reserve trenches, 600 men from a Guards Rifle Division. They would exploit whatever gaps the penal battalion created. They had ammunition, artillery support, and a reasonable expectation of survival. The shtrafnye had none of these. The Guards troops watched the penal soldiers with a mixture of pity and relief. Better them than us. At 4:59, Orlov raised a red flare pistol and fired into the sky. The crimson star arced upward, hung for a moment, then began its descent. "Forward!" Orlov shouted. "For the motherland! Redemption through blood!" The line of shtrafnye began moving across the frozen field. They walked, not ran. Running would mean hitting mines faster, triggering more casualties before paths could be identified. The doctrine was explicit: slow advance in line abreast. Maximum coverage of the suspected mine zone, survivors marking safe paths for following infantry. Dmitry Sokolov took his first step onto the field at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. The frost crunched under his boots. He could see perhaps 50 meters ahead in the growing dawn light. The German positions were silent, waiting. He knew they could see the penal battalion advancing. They were letting the shtrafnye get closer, waiting until the mines did their work. Then they would open fire on the survivors. 10 meters? 20. The line maintained rough cohesion, 294 men spread across an 800-meter front. Sokolov counted his steps, a habit from previous advances. Anything to keep his mind focused on something other than the mine that might be under his next footfall. At 47 meters, the first mine detonated. Private Karpov, the 18-year-old who had stolen bread, stepped on an S-mine's pressure trigger. There was a metallic click, then a small explosion as the mine launched upward. Karpov had just enough time to look down before the mine reached its apex at waist height and detonated. The explosion was a sharp crack, followed by a sound like hail hitting a tin roof as 360 steel balls shredded everything within a 10-meter radius. Karpov disintegrated from the waist up. Blood and tissue sprayed across the men near him. 3 other shtrafnye caught the blast. One died instantly with steel balls through his lungs and heart. Another fell screaming with his legs shredded below the knees. The third stumbled forward with wounds across his back and arms, but kept moving. "Don't stop!" Orlov shouted from behind the line. "Mark the crater and keep moving." The men nearest the explosion moved around the smoking hole, giving it a wide berth. The wounded man who had lost his legs tried to crawl after them, begging not to be left behind. No one stopped. Helping the wounded was forbidden. It slowed the advance. The man would bleed out or freeze within the hour. 60 meters, 80. The second mine went off, then a third, then two more in rapid succession as the line advanced deeper into the field. Each detonation carved a hole in the formation. Men fell screaming or died silently. The survivors marked the craters with whatever they had: torn pieces of uniform, broken rifles, bodies. These markers would guide the regular infantry following behind. Grigory Petrov, the burned tanker with the rifle, stepped between two craters and kept moving. He could hear wounded men crying for medics, for their mothers, for mercy. He ignored them. Mercy was a concept that didn't exist in a penal battalion. At 112 meters, the German machine guns opened fire. The MG-42s, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, created a sound like ripping canvas. Tracers streaked across the field in horizontal lines of red and white. Men fell in clusters as the interlocking fields of fire swept the advancing line. Petrov dropped flat, pressed himself into the frozen earth, felt bullets snap past inches above his head. Around him, shtrafnye, who remained standing, were cut down instantly. The doctrine said, keep advancing, but advancing into that fire was immediate suicide. Petrov crawled forward instead, using craters and corpses for cover. Dmitry Sokolov was on his belly 20 meters to Petrov's left when the machine gun fire started. He had survived long enough to develop instincts. He found a slight depression in the ground, probably a drainage ditch from the collective farm that had worked this land before the war, and pressed himself into it. Bullets tore through the air above him. Men screamed. More mines detonated as panicked shtrafnye ran in random directions trying to escape the machine gun fire. The entire field had become a killing zone designed with German precision. Mines to channel attackers into predetermined paths. Machine guns pre-sighted to cover those exact paths. The Red Army was feeding men into an industrial slaughter mechanism. From his command position, Orlov watched through binoculars as his battalion disintegrated. In less than 5 minutes, he estimated 60 to 70 casualties. The advance had stalled. Men were pinned down or dead. The mission was failing. He turned to a runner, a young lieutenant named Suslov, who served as the battalion's political officer. "Get on the radio. Tell division we need artillery on the German positions. Smoke rounds if they have them. We can't advance without suppression." Suslov nodded and ran toward the radio team positioned in a shell crater 300 meters back. But before artillery could be arranged, Captain Zhukov's blocking detachment made the decision for them. Zhukov had his orders. The penal battalion must advance, must clear the mines, must not retreat. He could see dozens of shtrafnye lying flat or crawling backward, away from the German fire. This was unauthorized withdrawal. This was cowardice. This was exactly what blocking detachments existed to prevent. "Traverse fire across the rear of their formation," Zhukov ordered his machine gunners. 50 rounds, high angle. Make them choose between German bullets and ours. The 3 Maxim guns opened fire, their heavy 7.62mm rounds arcing over the heads of the forward shtrafnye and impacting among those trying to retreat or stay down. The message was unmistakable. Forward into German fire or backward into Soviet fire. Death waited in both directions, but at least advancing offered the microscopic chance of reaching German trenches where you might kill the enemy before dying. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Men who had frozen in terror began moving again, scrambling forward through the minefield, taking casualties from both mines and machine guns, but at least moving. Sokolov heard the Soviet machine guns behind him and understood instantly. He rose from his depression and ran forward in a crouch, weaving between craters, leaping over bodies, his mind blank except for the primal imperative to survive the next 10 seconds. At 160 meters, enough shtrafnye had pushed through that the German defensive fire began to slacken. The MG-42 crews were reloading, their barrels overheating from sustained fire. This was the moment. Petrov, still armed with his rifle, spotted a German machine gun position in a reinforced timber bunker 200 meters ahead. The gunner's head and shoulders were visible as he lifted the weapon's receiver to swap in a fresh barrel. Petrov aimed, controlled his breathing despite his racing heart, and squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant barked. 200 meters away, the German gunner jerked backward, hit in the neck or upper chest. The machine gun went silent. Petrov worked the bolt, chambered another round, and fired at a second German position. Miss. He cycled the bolt again. Around him, other surviving shtrafnye who had weapons were firing now, suppressing the German positions through sheer volume, even though their accuracy was terrible. It didn't matter if they hit anything. The Germans had to take cover, had to stop firing for precious seconds, and those seconds allowed more penal soldiers to advance. At 220 meters, the survivors of the initial assault reached the edge of the minefield. Perhaps 80 men out of the original 294 were still on their feet and moving. They had marked a corridor roughly 60 meters wide through the mines, paid for with the bodies of 214 comrades. Soviet doctrine classified this as acceptable losses for the objective achieved. Orlov, moving forward with the second wave, radioed division headquarters. Penal Battalion 227 has cleared pathways through suspected mine zone. Casualties approximately 70%. Request immediate infantry assault to exploit before Germans reinforce positions. The response came within seconds. Approved. Guards infantry advancing now. Your battalion will assault German trenches directly. Pin defenders in place until guards arrive. There it was. The penal soldiers weren't done. Having cleared the mines, they were now expected to assault fortified positions with minimal ammunition and no support weapons. They were to be the anvil against which the Guards infantry would hammer the Germans. Orlov relayed the orders to his surviving troops, knowing it was a death sentence for most of them, knowing he had no choice, knowing this was exactly what penal battalions existed for. Dmitry Sokolov, crouched behind the body of a shtrafnik who had been cut in half by machine gun fire, heard the order to assault relayed by shouting officers. He had survived the minefield. He had survived the machine guns. Now he was expected to charge German trenches. He looked at his hands. He had no weapon, no rifle, no grenade, nothing. He had a shovel strapped to his belt, standard issue for digging. That would be his weapon, a shovel against machine guns and rifles. The mathematics of his survival had finally failed. This was the assault he wouldn't walk away from. And yet, when the whistle blew and the surviving shtrafnye rose from cover and began running toward the German positions, Sokolov ran with them. Not from courage or patriotism or faith in redemption. He ran because staying meant being shot by the NKVD blocking detachment. He ran because running forward gave him something to do besides think about dying. He ran because 213 other men had died in the last 10 minutes, and their deaths would mean nothing if the survivors didn't at least try to take the German positions. The final charge of Penal Battalion 227 across the last 180 meters to the German trenches lasted 93 seconds. In that minute and a half, German defenders killed 41 more shtrafnye with rifle fire, machine guns, and grenades thrown from the trenchworks. But 39 penal soldiers reached the German positions alive. They came over the parapets like demons from hell, screaming, swinging shovels and rifle butts, stabbing with bayonets, firing the last rounds from their weapons at point-blank range. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, who had been condemned as cowards and criminals, but were now proving in blood that they could fight as viciously as any Guards troops. Grigory Petrov shot 2 Germans with his rifle before it ran empty, then used it as a club to beat a third man unconscious. Dmitry Sokolov swung his shovel into a German soldier's face, felt bone crunch, pulled it free, and struck again. The German trench, 30 meters of zigzag construction, became a close-quarters slaughterhouse. No quarter asked or given, just primal violence between men who moments earlier had been trying to kill each other from a distance. And then the Guards infantry arrived. 600 men from the 96th Guards Rifle Division poured through the corridors the Penal Battalion had marked in the minefield, overran the German positions with overwhelming numbers, and pushed the defenders back towards secondary positions 500 meters further east. The German strong point that had held against probing attacks for 3 days fell in 18 minutes once the mines were cleared, and the first wave of shtrafnye had pinned the defenders. By 6:47 in the morning, the position was secured. Soviet medics moved through the field, treating the wounded who could be saved, shooting the mortally wounded who begged for mercy. The bodies of the penal soldiers who had cleared the mines were left where they fell. Recovering the dead was not a priority. They would be buried later by labor details, or not at all. Senior Lieutenant Orlov stood in the captured German trench, surrounded by corpses, and counted his survivors. 21. Out of 294 who had begun the assault 98 minutes earlier, 21 were still alive and relatively unwounded. Another 13 were wounded but ambulatory. 7 were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization. If those 7 survived, they would be granted redemption and returned to regular units. The other 14 would remain shtrafnye until they earned their way out through more blood. Dmitry Sokolov sat against the trench wall, his shovel still in his hand, covered in blood and dirt and things he didn't want to identify. He had survived. Again. He looked at the shovel, at the German blood drying on its blade, and felt nothing, no relief, no horror, no pride, just exhaustion. Grigory Petrov found him there an hour later. "You made it, Dmitry Antonovich." "So did you." 87th mission, Petrov said quietly. "You?" "8th. They sat in silence for a while, watching medics and burial details work. Finally, Sokolov asked, "Does it get easier?" "No," Petrov said. "You just get number. And then one day you don't get number anymore, and that's when you die." "How much longer?" "For redemption, I need 63 more days, if I live that long." Sokolov did the math. At the current casualty rate, the odds of Petrov surviving 63 more days were effectively 0. But saying that seemed cruel, so he said nothing. The German defenders who had survived the assault and been captured were marched to the rear for interrogation. A young Obergefreiter, wounded in the leg, stared at the corpses of the penal soldiers scattered across the minefield. He asked his Soviet guard, in broken Russian, "Why? Why send men with no weapons into mines? This is murder, not war." The guard, a sergeant from the Guards Division, shrugged. They were criminals, cowards. They redeemed themselves. "Redeemed?" The German's voice rose despite his pain. "You murdered them, your own people." The sergeant's face hardened. "You murdered the 27 million of our people. You burned our villages, killed our children, starved our cities. These men died fighting you. That's redemption enough." The German fell silent. What could he say? His nation had indeed done those things. His army had implemented those policies. And now the Red Army was using methods that matched German brutality, feeding its own citizens into industrial death to push the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin. The strategic impact of operations like the October 14th assault extended far beyond the tactical capture of one strongpoint. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet penal battalions conducted thousands of similar missions. The casualty rates were staggering and consistent. Historical records declassified after the Soviet Union's collapse revealed the brutal mathematics. Approximately 427,000 men served in penal battalions during the war. Of those, roughly 52% were killed in action, compared to 26% casualty rates for regular rifle divisions. The average time served before death or serious wounding was 37 days. Only 16% of shtrafnye survived long enough to earn redemption through 3 months of service or serious wounds. The rest died, were permanently disabled, or remained in penal units until war's end. The official Soviet history of the war, published in multiple volumes between 1960 and 1965, mentioned penal battalions in exactly 3 paragraphs. The full extent of the system remained classified until 1992. Veterans of penal battalions who survived rarely spoke of their service. The stigma of having been labeled cowards or criminals persisted decades after their supposed redemption. Many never told their families where they had truly served. Pyotr Orlov commanded Penal Battalion 227 for 4 more months after the October 14th assault. He led 32 more operations, each one a variation of the same theme: impossible missions, minimal support, maximum casualties. By February 1944, he had written 417 letters to families of dead shtrafnye. His own redemption came not through survival, but through wounds. On February 17, 1944, during an assault near Krivoy Rog, German artillery fire caught him in the open. Shrapnel tore through his left leg and abdomen. He was evacuated, spent 4 months in hospital, and was eventually reassigned to a training command far from the front. His rank was restored. His record was cleared. He had been redeemed. He never spoke about his time commanding the Penal Battalion. Not to his wife, not to his children, not even to his fellow officers. When he died in 1981, his family found a cardboard box in his closet containing 417 envelopes, each one addressed to a mother, father, or wife of a man who had died under his command. Each envelope contained a brief letter in his handwriting, never sent, explaining how the man had died bravely, had redeemed himself through courage, had given his life for the motherland. The families had received official notices, of course, but not these letters. Orlov had kept them, a private memorial to men the state preferred to forget. Dmitry Sokolov survived 84 days as a shtrafnye. On January 6, 1944, during an assault on German positions at Apostolovo, he was seriously wounded by mortar fire. Both legs were broken, his pelvis fractured, internal injuries extensive. He spent 6 months in hospital, underwent 3 surgeries, and was eventually discharged from military service with a medical disability. His sentence was declared fulfilled through blood and wounds. He returned to Tula in July 1944, walking with a cane. His teaching career ended by injuries that left him in constant pain. He married in 1946, had 2 children, worked as a librarian because he could sit while working. He never told his family he had been in a penal battalion. The official story was that he had been wounded in regular infantry combat. The truth died with him in 1974. His wife found a small notebook among his possessions after his death. Inside were 84 pencil marks, one for each day he had survived as a shtrafnye, and below them, 273 names. The men he had watched die. No other words, no explanation, just names and marks. Grigory Petrov didn't survive to redemption. He died on November 3, 1943, 21 days after the October 14th assault, during a night attack on German positions near Kakhovka. He was killed by machine gun fire while leading a small group of shtrafniki across open ground. According to the after-action report, he had advanced to within 20 meters of the German position before being hit multiple times in the chest. He was 24 years old. He had needed 42 more days to complete his sentence. There was no letter to his family explaining his death or acknowledging his service. The official record listed him as killed in action, nothing more. His younger brother, who survived the war serving in a tank battalion, spent 15 years after the war trying to find out where Grigory had died and under what circumstances. He never learned the truth. The penal battalion records were sealed. The German defenders who faced penal battalion assaults never fully understood what they were fighting against until they captured prisoners or overran Soviet positions and found documents. When they did understand, the reactions varied. Some felt horror at Soviet willingness to sacrifice their own men so casually. Others felt a grim respect for soldiers who kept advancing despite impossible odds. A few recognized the terrifying strategic implication. An enemy willing to spend human lives with such calculation possessed a ruthlessness that couldn't be matched or defeated through conventional means. Oberst Heinrich von Rantzau, commanding the 79th Infantry Division during defensive operations in southern Ukraine, wrote in his personal diary in November 1943, "Today we repulsed another attack by Soviet penal troops. They came across the minefields we had laid, walking slowly in extended line. We did not fire at first, thinking they were merely reconnoitering. Then they began to trigger mines. The explosions continued for 10 minutes. Men died by the dozens, yet the survivors kept walking forward, marking paths through the mines with bodies of their comrades. When they finally reached our positions, they attacked with shovels and knives, having no firearms. We killed all of them. It was not combat, it was execution. What manner of nation treats its own soldiers thus? What manner of soldier continues advancing into certain death? We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a phenomenon we cannot comprehend. The psychological impact on Soviet regular troops who witnessed penal battalion operations was complex and rarely discussed. On one hand, the existence of penal battalions served as a powerful deterrent against unauthorized retreat or cowardice. Every soldier knew that one mistake, one moment of panic, One wrong decision by a superior looking for a scapegoat could result in a sentence to the shtrafnye. This knowledge kept men in line when everything in them screamed to run. On the other hand, watching penal troops get slaughtered in missions that had no chance of success created a corrosive cynicism about Soviet leadership. Many soldiers, particularly veterans, recognized that the penal system was often arbitrary. Good men ended up as shtrafnye through bad luck or political grudges. Brave men died, proving courage they had already demonstrated. The system created its own victims, then fed those victims to German guns to solve tactical problems. Guards troops who followed behind penal battalion assaults rarely spoke about what they saw, but their letters home, when they could write them, sometimes hinted at the horror. We advanced across a field after the first wave cleared the obstacles. I do not wish to describe what I saw. It is enough to say that we walked on a carpet of our own men, and we did not slow down, because slowing down would mean thinking about what we walked upon. The NKVD blocking detachment troops existed in a peculiar moral space. They were not frontline combat soldiers, yet they killed more Soviet troops than many German units. They viewed their role as essential to maintaining discipline, preventing panic, ensuring that the Red Army fought effectively despite its losses. Captain Nikolai Zhukov, who commanded the blocking detachment supporting Penal Battalion 227, survived the war and returned to NKVD service in internal security. He was interviewed in 1990, shortly before his death, as part of an oral history project. The interview was never published, but transcripts survived. Asked about his role in blocking detachments, Zhukov's response was devoid of remorse. "We did what was necessary. The penal soldiers were guilty of crimes against military discipline. They had a choice: redeem themselves or die. We enforced that choice. Without blocking detachments, the penal battalions would have dissolved, men would have fled, and the missions would have failed. Yes, we shot men who tried to retreat. That was our duty. Those men were already dead by legal judgment. We simply enforced the execution if they refused to earn their reprieve. I killed 11 men in 6 months. Each one had refused to advance when ordered. Each one chose his own death by that refusal. I feel no guilt. I served the motherland." Zhukov died in 1991, 3 days before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. He never expressed regret. The mathematics of penal battalion operations were coldly rational from a strategic perspective. German defensive positions in 1943-44 were heavily fortified, protected by mines, wire, interlocking fire zones, and prepared artillery strikes. Clearing these obstacles conventionally required engineers with mine detectors, sappers with explosive charges, artillery preparation, and infantry assaults with armor support. All of this took time and consumed resources. Penal battalions solved the problem through expenditure of lives instead of materiel. 500 shtrafnye could clear a minefield in 20 minutes that would take engineers hours to clear safely. Yes, 300 of those shtrafnye would die, but the 200 survivors would have mapped the safe corridors, and the regular infantry could exploit immediately. From a purely logistical standpoint, lives were more renewable than equipment in the Soviet system of 1943. The USSR had mobilized over 34 million people into military service during the war. Equipment production, while massive, still lagged behind manpower availability. Trading condemned men for territorial gains made brutal mathematical sense to Soviet planners who viewed warfare as an industrial process. The long-term consequences of the penal battalion system extended far beyond the war itself. The willingness to treat human life as expendable commodity became embedded in Soviet military culture. During the Afghan War in the 1980s, Soviet commanders sometimes employed similar tactics, sending understrength or poorly equipped units into impossible situations, accepting catastrophic losses to achieve objectives. The institutional memory of 1943 had taught that soldiers could be spent to solve tactical problems. That lesson persisted for decades. For Germany, facing penal battalion assaults provided a glimpse into the ideological abyss that separated the Third Reich from the Soviet Union. Both regimes treated human life with contempt. Both murdered millions. Both built systems of industrial death. But the specific application differed. The Nazis murdered those they defined as subhuman: the Jews, Slavs, Roma, disabled, political enemies. The Soviets murdered those who failed to meet ideological standards of courage, loyalty, or productivity, including their own soldiers who had fought and bled. The German defenders who witnessed penal battalion tactics recognized uncomfortably that they faced an enemy whose ruthlessness matched and perhaps exceeded their own. In the frozen fields 16 kilometers southwest of Melitopol, the bodies of 214 shtrafnye remained where they fell for 3 weeks. The Red Army advanced too quickly to organize proper burial details. German forces retreating through the area in early November observed the corpses, noted the Soviet uniform remnants mixed with civilian clothing some penal soldiers wore, and photographed the scene. These photographs, captured by advancing Soviet forces in 1944 and classified until 1994, show the reality of penal battalion operations more clearly than any official history. Rows of dead men in rough lines, the pathways they cleared through the minefield visible as corridors of bodies. Some corpses missing limbs from mine explosions, others showing bullet wounds from machine gun fire, a few showing wounds that forensic analysis later suggested came from behind, from Soviet blocking detachment fire. The families of the 214 men who died that October morning received standardized notices, killed in action in fulfillment of his duty to the motherland. No mention of penal battalions, no explanation of how or why, just the bureaucratic acknowledgement of death. Some families later received medals posthumously awarded, the Medal for Courage, the Medal for Battle Merit. These medals recognize bravery in combat, implicitly redeeming the dead from their criminal sentences. But many families never learned their sons, husbands, or fathers had been shtrafnye. The stigma was too great. The state preferred silence. When Dmitry Sokolov lay in his hospital bed in January 1944, legs immobilized in casts, body racked with pain from injuries that would cripple him permanently, a political officer visited to inform him his sentence was complete. "You have redeemed yourself through blood and wounds, Comrade Sokolov. Your record is cleared. You have served the motherland honorably." Sokolov stared at the ceiling and said nothing. Redeemed. The word meant nothing. He had survived by luck and animal instinct while better men than him had died. He had killed Germans with a shovel, had walked across the bodies of his comrades, had become something less than human to stay alive. And now the state declared him redeemed, as if a bureaucratic stamp could restore what had been destroyed in those minefields. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep until the political officer left. Later, alone, he wept silently, careful not to let the nurses hear. Not from pain, though his body screamed agony. He wept for Private Karpov, 18 years old, who had stolen bread and been torn apart by an S-mine. For the 213 others who died on October 14th. For himself, who had survived but would never again be the man he was. The final accounting of the Soviet penal battalion system remains incomplete. Records were destroyed, survivors stayed silent, and the Soviet state deliberately obscured the truth for half a century. But the evidence that survived, it tells a story of calculated brutality, of a military system that consumed its own people to fuel victory, of men condemned as cowards who proved their courage in the worst possible ways. They cleared minefields by walking through them. They assaulted machine guns with shovels. They died in their thousands to purchase meters of ground. And when they had bled enough, the state granted them redemption and tried to forget they existed. Their story stands as testimony to the true cost of victory on the Eastern Front, not just the soldiers